Mr. Danilo Türk, thank you very much for accepting our invitation to be a guest speaker at the School of International Relations.
Thank you for inviting me.
You were president of the Republic of Slovenia from 2007 to 2012, after a very distinguished career in which you served as member of the Constitutional Commission of the Slovenian National Assembly, as the Slovenian representative to the United Nations, as president of the UN Security Council, as member of the UN Human Rights Committee, and as Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs. 25 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and almost 40 years after the Helsinki Final Act, and almost 70 years after the UN Charter was adopted, today the world is still a world in transition. We are witnessing a shift in the global security agenda nowadays. What are the main security challenges that we're facing today, in your view?
Well, first of all, we have to understand that history never ends. And if people thought about the ending of Cold War as an end of history, which was a fashionable phrase at that time, not necessarily believed, one has to understand that security problems were bound to continue, to mutate, and some of them to re-emerge. So if one talks about security challenges today, one can clearly see that many of them are not state-centered, that they originate from sources other than states, like terrorism, like internationally organized crime, also certain diseases which are spreading. And all this represents a more complicated security agenda than the one that we witnessed at the time before the ending of the Cold War. We also have seen a re-entering of certain geopolitical questions which result from movement of the world from a unipolar to a multipolar situation. And obviously the security agenda today is rather complex and consists of these two types of questions, some of which, as I said, resulting from non-state sources, and the others resulting from geopolitics. And of course, international institutions can play a role in handling these security challenges, but they are not alone. Major tasks are to be performed by major states, and there are spaces for all states to cooperate, and also for non-state actors, civil society, to cooperate.
What are the main measures that should be undertaken in order to improve our global security?
If one talks about global security, a simple answer would be an agreement among the permanent members of the UN Security Council, P5. They are nuclear powers. They are the countries with the largest power in military terms, and they are also countries with largest responsibilities. Now, of course, it's very difficult to find an agreement among P5 which would be sufficiently all-encompassing. There is much work to be done by others as well. And there are certain tasks which are really quite demanding. If one takes an example of counterterrorism today, counterterrorism has to be pursued in accordance with our values. Values of human rights, values of rule of law. And we are not talking about generalities here. We are talking about implementation of our values in a manner which gives counterterrorism the necessary effectiveness, while at the same time it preserves our democracy, human rights, our basic values. These are implementational tasks, not declaratory.
Indeed. The UN Millennium Development Goals expire this year, 2015. What are the results of this global effort in your view?
Well, the world has improved in recent decade, and some people have been even surprised that the results have been better than expected, let's say 5 years ago. I mean, the poverty eradication, poverty reduction has taken place in many parts of the world. There have been improvement in such areas as maternal health and reduction of child mortality and similar measurable indicators. So there has been an improvement. And this is a source of encouragement. But of course, for the future, one has to understand that in the world as a whole, according to economists, 80% of global population lives with less than $10 a day. That tells us something about the magnitude of the task for the future. So while the optimists would say that poverty, the extreme poverty, the abject poverty can be reduced by 2030, which should be the objective of the new development goals, sustainable development goals, we also have to understand that the problems of poverty are much larger. As I said, 80% of the global population lives with less than $10 a day. And of course that means that much has to change in the world, and that this restructuring and changes will have to happen in the coming 10 to 15 years. Much of that will have to change in that period of time.
Mm-hmm. What can civil society do to help to achieve these goals?
Well, so civil society is really very important and very effective. Today, the discussion on sustainability is largely driven by civil society. The governments, of course, they have important worries which are very immediate. If you take, for example, the question of budget balance, unemployment, and tasks which in the field of economics are not very easy to implement. But then civil society pressure is there, and if one takes, for example, the year 2015 and the preparations for the Paris summit on global climate, one would see that the pressure from civil society is critical. Without that, not much is likely to happen. With that, of course, there can be a significant agreement.
Mm-hmm. President Türk, thank you very much for your time, and I hope to see you back at IE very soon.
Thank you. Thank you. Pleasure is mine.